Aloha and welcome to our 7th season of Human Rights and Sustainability Campus Community Dialogue. We focused on these events every month to connect the islands, to be able to have conversations about important issues at the international, but also here in the islands of Hawaii. And today we're fortunate to have 3 amazing speakers. We'll begin first with Ulf Johansen Dade. His talk will be on Between Words and Action, Indigenous Peoples, Natural Resources, and the Future of Sustainable Development. Then we have Ashli Akins, who will speak on economic, social, and cultural rights and indigenous peoples, a case study of community-based international development among the Quechua people in Peru. And then the keynote is Helena Norberg-Hodge. She'll be talking about globalization, education for action, creating a human rights-based approach to sustainable development. And this is a continuation of the discussion we had throughout the fall, focusing on the sustainable development and specifically connecting with the negotiations that are taking place right now on the sustainable development goals. And our talks today are very much focusing on culture and the importance of culture, which was also a key advocacy point raised by the Indigenous caucus in the negotiations for the sustainable development goals, and will be brought up very much by Helena Norberg-Hodge based on her decades of research, but also on the most recent negotiations that will take place between now and September when the new Sustainable Development Goals will be adopted. So I'd like to introduce Ulf Johansen Dade to come up here to be able to speak. He's an anthropologist and lawyer from the University of Lund in Sweden, and he's been working for the last part of a century on these important issues of indigenous people's rights. You just put it right there. So thank you very much, Ulf. There you go.
So should I sit or stand? Okay. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, Ulla and Josh, and maybe others. It's a pleasure to come here and talk to you. And I'm an anthropologist from Lund University in Sweden, and I've been working on indigenous issues. I'm not sure I'm going to say very much about the Sustainable Development Goals because they're quite new and they are negotiated. But we can maybe discuss something about indigenous peoples and the paradoxical relationship they have to the surrounding world, you can say, both in terms of sustainable development, but also politically to governments or nation states, whatever it is. And this situation that still exists in many parts of the world it have a long historical continuation, actually, which I like to point out. I have a short speak here, and then we open up for questions or comments or critique, whatever you want to call it. So we have time to talk about issues that you want to talk about also in the end. Someone there? Okay. Okay. Being an anthropologist talking about indigenous peoples is, as you might know, a little bit schizophrenic. During the last 30 years or so, anthropologists have actually, indigenous peoples is the classical study object, of course, as you might know, even if you're not anthropologists yourselves. But during the last 30 years, a lot of anthropologists have been asking questions like, is there really such a thing as indigenous peoples? And some people still says, of course there are, because they say they are still out there, and they call themselves indigenous peoples and such things. But anthropologists, at least some of them, have tried to challenge that idea and call them a kind of a effect of the class society. Especially the Marxist-inclined anthropologists around the world have challenged the idea that you have a certain ethnic category. It's a non-category, as some anthropologists says, and it's basically a rest of the class society, a category of the class society. But this discussion I won't sort of develop very much here. I will just notify, because some anthropologists will certainly disagree with the idea that indigenous peoples are a special category that we should actually think about, because they say things like it's a social construction, and if you think there are indigenous people, you can always say, well, everything is a social construction, isn't it? Because we also say that everything is political and everything is social, you could also argue. Everything is social constructed. Some people even say that nature is an ecology is socially constructed. There is no nature without humans, and we don't actually know how the nature would look like without humans, would we? Okay, anyway, today I would see two trends with a long historical continuity in indigenous people studies, and I would say there are one trend, of course, to see indigenous peoples as a hinder to national development. Still, in many parts of the world, indigenous peoples are considered to be a hinder for national development. Especially in post-colonial settings, many people believe that after colonialism, the situation of indigenous peoples would be better or changed or whatever. But a lot of indigenous peoples have, on the contrary, met a new hostile political and social environment because they, in some cases, refuse to sort of adapt to the modern ways of modern development in the countries they are living in. And some governments still call them hinder to national development. The other side is, of course, more sort of positive towards indigenous peoples and call them maybe not the savior of our world today, but anyway, very important actors in teaching us how to solve our environmental problems, sustainable development, for instance, and so on. So there's also demand for indigenous traditional knowledge, you could say, which is also reflected in United Nations environment, for instance, where indigenous peoples are brought in to sort of help out researchers and governments to how to solve imminent environmental problems around the world. So you have these two sort of contrasting views of indigenous peoples, and a lot of course, environmental groups, non-governmental organizations have seen indigenous people as carrying some kind of very important knowledge about the nature, for instance, or ecological systems in our times, where we see, well, at least the modern kind of developers or modern nation states have sort of lost the traditional knowledge how to actually develop nature in a sustainable way. These two paradoxical kind of contrasts idea about the indigenous peoples have a very long history, of course. As long as we talked about the indigenous peoples, at least for the last 500 years, there have been at least two opposing ideas about indigenous peoples, you could say. From the beginning, of course, in the 16th century, people thought of them as non-humans. When the Europeans came to the Americas, as you know, they weren't called real humans because they didn't believe in the Christian God. So they were actually non-humans in one sense. And this developed later in the 18th century with the Enlightenment period. When it changed, they didn't have to believe in the Christian God anymore to be human, so to say. But the Enlightenment thinkers, they introduced a new idea to sort of marginalize indigenous peoples, and that was the distinction between civilization and primitive societies. And you were primitive in that area because you didn't know how to do agriculture in the Western European way. So they were called primitives. And this idea about the civilized societies and primitive societies lasted actually well into the 20th century, I would argue. And it's just recently that we sort of challenged that distinction between civilized and primitive people, and it was probably in the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, not very long ago, that actually indigenous peoples were called indigenous peoples and not primitives. Anthropologists that studied these people, indigenous peoples, for a long time, they still in the 50s and 60s they wrote books about primitive peoples, entitled Primitive Peoples. So The concept of indigenous, which is a political concept, of course, or as most concepts we're using here, is a fairly new construction, you could say, to describe, try to describe these people and the special experiences and so on around the world. So try to cover the different experiences, of course, for indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, as all of us, have different experiences, live in different contexts, of course, but basically they have also a lot of things in common, you could say. They have problems with land rights. Even if you live in Hawaii, Africa, India, Bangladesh, or in Siberia, you probably, if you're in the indigenous group, you probably have a land rights issue with the government. So on a certain level, you have a lot of things in common. Of course, in practice and in the details, there are different kind of political issues at stake when it comes to land rights or sustainable development and such things. But on one level, there's a lot of things common for indigenous peoples in the developed world and developing countries. So a lot of similarities for indigenous peoples all around the world. So that leaves us back to today, you could say. Hinder for development or the promise of development. You can choose what you want to see there. I can also refer to some NGOs, environmental NGOs in the United States and Europe have been sort of disappointed also with indigenous peoples after a while, because indigenous peoples, they still want to pursue traditional ways of living in certain areas. They want to hunt and eat seal or whales or animals of certain kind that they always have been doing, and that hasn't been very popular among certain environmental groups. So we still have, even if indigenous people sometimes are seen as the solution for many of the problems in the world, a lot of groups have also been disappointed at, so there have been sort of conflicts between environmental groups and indigenous peoples especially, I would argue. So it's not a very easy relationship, of course. But this is also a kind of a romanticizing indigenous people. Why should we care about indigenous peoples? Why should we study indigenous peoples? There's a lot of answers to this, of course, why we should study indigenous people. Some people would say that we need to learn about how it really works out there, because indigenous people have some kind of knowledge of that. Of course, that is very important, and we should study them. And if we have a good intention, so to say, others, there are also pharmaceutical companies that are interested in the knowledge of traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples around the world. Medical plants, as you know, are a hot topic these days, and there's a hunt for medical plants and knowledge about them all around the world, especially, of course, in the Amazon and certain areas in Africa and so on, where there's an abundance of medical plants, and the people there knows a lot of things about these plants, of course, that could be useful for us. So there's a commercial interest for indigenous people. There are also a sort of social science interest in knowing about indigenous peoples. I don't think we should study indigenous people because they are better than us or better than anyone else in handling problematic things that we face in this world today. I think we should study because we also, it's important, of course, that we study indigenous people, but we should also learn about a lot of things about ourselves by studying indigenous peoples. How does it work when we exclude groups in our society? What kind of discourses are at play in our society when we sort of exclude certain people on certain arguments, you could say, so that we can learn about how our own society or our own ideas develops and exclude people, and maybe we can learn something from that and change our ideas for the future or something like that, which is an important aspect, I think, at least for being an anthropologist. You could learn a lot about our own society, how it works, and not works, or how it should work, maybe. What else should we say here? What happenings today is that, for instance, when it comes to sustainable development, I've been part of a project, research project in India during the last 3 years, and it concerns water management, and it sort of illustrates the whole dilemma that I think that indigenous peoples are facing in today's world still. This project takes part in Bihar, in the northeast of India, just west of Calcutta. And it's a water management project, and the indigenous people in the southern parts of Bihar, the state of Bihar, have been sort of facing water stress during the last decade, you could say. Water stress means not water scarcity. They have a lot of water still in Bihar, but the water doesn't come when it's supposed to come. So the monsoon rains, for instance, have changed their patterns. The monsoon rains are coming later in the season, so it sort of destroys the rice harvest. So the whole pattern of putting rice in the ground and harvesting rice have been changed, and then because if the rain comes later, other problems will occur in the end, because the seasonal drought will be also changed, of course. So the whole thing of rice harvesting is becoming a problem, which means that Bihar, that used to be actually a kind of a place where the fed large part of India with rice before, now have to import their own rice all of a sudden. But the climate change is not only the answer to this problem. There's also social constructions in this. The government of India is like any other modern nation state, interested in national development of certain kinds. And water is crucial for every society, of course. Even modern societies need water. And they, at the universities of India, they educate a lot of civil engineers. Water engineering is a major topic in India to deal with the water stress problems they have in India. Bihar is not the only place in India where they have water stress problems. It's all over, actually. But anyway, the social engineering has led to the government want to modernize the water management system. So they put a lot of newly educated engineers out in the field to handle the water situation, which has meant that the traditional knowledge about the water management system have been sort of taken away. And a huge part, and an important part of the water stress problem today is what we have seen. I'm working together with two other anthropologists in this case, one Indian anthropologist also. What we have seen is that in the areas where the modern sort of water management system have been put in place, it doesn't work really good. It's overflooding, and the rice harvest is destroyed and so on. But in places, in areas very close to that, where traditional water management is still in place, it seems to work. And this traditional knowledge about water management system seems to be able to handle the overflooding. When it comes a lot of rain and the snow melting from the Himalayas come down to Bihar. Bihar is just south of the Himalayas, so they get a lot of water from the mountains in the springtime, so to say, when the snow and ice is melting. But the traditional system seems to be able to handle that. And when you talk to the farmers there, they say, well, we've been doing this for thousands of years. So it's a kind of traditional knowledge that still works, while the modern kind of ideas of water management don't seem to work that well. So that's a problem still indigenous people are facing in this world. And I've talked enough, according to Josh, Okay, thank you for listening. Now I'm very curious about your questions and comments. Or you want to talk first, and then we, okay, sure, absolutely. Thank you, thank you.
Hello, everybody. So I'm here from the University of British Columbia in Canada, and I just started my PhD in September in interdisciplinary studies at the Lund Institute for Global Issues, and I'm looking at the role of arts and language in being able to reclaim voice for oppressed populations internationally. So I just finished last year, I just finished my master's at the University of Oxford in international human rights law, looking at this question. So is the loss of culturally significant art a human rights violation? And it was a very interesting research topic because it led me to a variety of international instruments that actually say, yes, it is in fact a human rights violation. There's over a dozen international instruments that claim that, both binding and non-binding, and that was really reassuring and actually quite surprising for me. I thought that I would have to invent a law to try and make this dissertation possible. But then I started looking at, okay, so these are some of the key articles that those various instruments look at. So for example, there's the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. There's the UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. There's a variety of various instruments, but all of them generally fight for the right for art as an important ingredient in culture and cultural heritage, and that it is an important aspect of culture and therefore should be a right. And one of the biggest things that I realized was that it's not actually that art is a right, it's the freedom to be an artist. So that option to choose is really important. And if that option has been taken away, and therefore there is no agency anymore in a person or a community to be able to express themselves as artists or use their art, that is when there has been indeed a human rights violation. So I then looked at why there are still so many violations about the right to art around the world if there are all these instruments. And there's a huge gap between the instruments that are there and what's actually happening in the communities on the ground with artists, and especially with Indigenous communities. And so I looked at why that isn't being fulfilled and where that implementation gap gets lost. And it ended up realizing that there were three key threats to the loss of art around the world. So that's economic barriers, severance of relationships, so relationships between elders and youth, as well as between artists and their environment, and censorship. So that's a very brief overview of my research at Oxford that has led me now to explore that further in my PhD. But today I wanted to, rather than go into the theory of this, I wanted to bring you to the reason why I became so passionate about this topic and the more community-based side of it. And so when I first ended up deciding to do my master's in international human rights law, it wasn't because I wanted to be a lawyer or a policymaker, but it was because I've been working in Peru for the past 8.5 years and was feeling extremely frustrated with being an advocate for change and seeing these human rights violations over and over and over again, but also seeing this massive gap in translation that in the implementation, and wanting to then be able to also be an agent for change. So I'll tell you a little bit about the work that I'm doing in Peru. I started I started working there quite accidentally when I was 20 years old, and I took a year off of my undergrad at the University of Victoria to travel Central and South America, and for all the reasons that most people backpack Central and South America. I wanted to learn Spanish. I'm a photographer, so I wanted to explore that, but I also wanted to, somewhere along the way, do something positive with my time and be able to contribute as a volunteer somewhere. But I don't believe in signing up for a large organization, going into a community and a culture that is not my own, and saying, I know what you need. I know that I can help you. Because I had no idea, and I might actually be more burden than help. And so I ended up, after about 7 months, in this little town called Ollantaytambo in the Sacred Valley of Peru. And it's the last town of the Andean mountains before the road stops. And you literally have to start hiking or take a train to go to Machu Picchu, one of the 7 wonders of the world. And I fell in love with this town, and I started working with a local museum there that is now shut down, but at the time was doing incredible work trying to restore the textile tradition. And through working with them, I got to know a lot of stories of the people who became my very, very close family and friends over the months and now over the years. And everyone's stories were very different and very unique, but generally they all had the same theme, that they felt that they had to choose between economic development, and that was done in a way that was not giving them community voice and keeping their culture alive, but that they couldn't have both. So I wanted to discuss these issues a little bit today. So the first one is that of cultural degradation. So in this area, this is the Quechua population, so it's the indigenous peoples of the Andean Mountains. It's an oral language, an oral culture, and it spans several countries. But most of their communities thrive off of both farming and weaving to keep their culture and communities alive. And farming there is very different than farming in North America, in the sense that it's about 3,500 meters. I speak meters, I have no idea, around 12,000 feet maybe, I'm not sure. So it's 3,500 meters above sea level, very high up, and so it's very hard to grow any crops. So a lot of the communities I work with there, one of the communities only has ever tasted a potato in their entire life, but they have tasted about 240 varieties of potatoes. It's also all mountain terrain, so all of their agriculture has to be built by hand with no machines on terraced land all the way up the mountain. And so it's very innovative, and it has incredible traditional knowledge that has stemmed back centuries. The weaving is just as important as the farming for the sustainability of these communities. So this weaving, it's on a backstrap loom. I usually bring textiles with me, but it's beautiful textiles that are on a backstrap loom that are made with natural alpaca and sheep wool and with dyes from the plants of the region. So it's about over 100 different plants in the Andes that with the right color combinations can make thousands of colors in these textiles. And this tradition, just like the farming, has been passed down century after century and completely orally from elder to youth. And along with the traditional knowledge of the shearing of the alpaca, the spinning of the wool, the dyeing, the actual weaving, are these symbols, this incredible iconography that starts painting a history book of the Quechua people. And if you learn how to read the textiles, you can start learning so much about the weaver, her life, her community, her history, her values. And these textiles have become basically the only way that the Quechua women can tell their own story from their own voice with their own hands and heart, not from the many books from white anthropologists or men or other people who have talked about them, but they're able to tell their own stories. So the symbol in the bottom right there is my favorite symbol. It's the kente, which means hummingbird. And it's their symbol for reciprocity. And it's 2 hummingbirds feeding one another. And it represents revitalization and rebirth for new life. And it's often depicted in wedding quilts or in blankets from a mother to a daughter, symbolizing love and nurturing. So this tradition has stemmed back centuries, as I said, but it's very important. Quechua is an oral language, but they're starting to phonetically try to transcribe it for Spanish speakers to keep the language alive. So this is a quote that is a phonetic transcription of Quechua that is from an elder in the region. And he says, the cloth is, I don't remember it exactly, but the cloth is as important as the elders, and therefore we must revere the cloth as much as we revere the elders to be able to honor the amount of work that they've put into it with their heart, their spirit, and their soul. So this tradition now is in great decline because it's now facing its greatest challenge ever, which is the globalized capitalist marketplace. So they now are faced with machine-made knockoffs, synthetic knockoffs of their original work, and they can't sell their textiles for a fair trade price with the competition that's going on in the region. And so the elders are very worried that within this one generation, because it's an oral tradition, if the youth don't learn how to weave, the entire weaving tradition will be wiped out when the elders pass away. So that was the first issue that was being told to me. The second was that about economic instability. So the youth, while they're worried about their culture, they're also really worried about getting a job. And this is Ollantaytambo, and this is just one of many hub communities that are in the region. So the communities that have the markets, the bus depots, the high schools, where Indigenous communities all along the mountaintops come down to these hub communities to be able to study and work. And in Ollantaytambo, the youth that are graduating high school right now are faced with a very interesting dilemma where there's so much tourism and development that's coming into the area. And so they have brand new job sectors at their fingertips. They have, road construction, hotels, restaurants, tourism. But they're the very first generation that has to deal with those job sectors. So they don't have teachers or role models who can train them in how to get employed in these new jobs. And so while there's so much economic development coming in, outsiders from Cusco, from Lima, from abroad can easily come into the communities and take all the jobs away from the locals. And so the local youth are left unemployed and poorer than had development never been there in the first place. So while there's so much tourism, the tourists, if they're not educated, and most aren't because the tour agencies are not necessarily collaborating with the community voices, they see what they want to see, and they see what they've been told to see without knowing what's behind the walls. And so a tourist, for example, in Ollantaytambo will stay in a 5-star hotel with amenities and even sometimes drinking water, which is unheard of in that region, flush toilets, while a family literally on the other side of the wall will have a house like this, as one of my students' houses, where it's a very unsanitary kitchen and a hole in the ground for a bathroom. So I'm just going to speed up because I'd like to wrap up. But these were the two dichotomies that were going on in the region. And eventually, after about 4 months of working with this community, they asked me to figure out a way so that they no longer had to choose between economic development and cultural revitalization, but that they could actually have both. And so, being a naive, at that point, 21-year-old, I said yes. And I started thinking about how could I flip these vicious cycles in a way that can respond to their needs. And mainly, it was that these issues need to collaborate rather than compete. So the textiles need to financially support the communities, but also the development needs to respect the cultural and community needs more than it is. But even if both of those local issues are dealt with, there's a wider issue of external pressures, where there's still going to be globalization and tourism coming in for the foreseeable future, whether or not we want that to be the case. And so how can we make those external pressures positive ones rather than negative ones? So I started what's called Moskwe, which means dream in Quechua. And we have 3 different programs in the region. The first is the Kente Textile Community Program, which works with weavers, about 150 weavers in the region, to provide fair trade market outlets and capacity building for the weavers. And 100% of the profits from their weavings go back into the community in a cycle. So a portion goes to the weaver, another portion goes to the community for basically like a bank account in a lump sum where however the community chooses to develop, they raise those funds through the profit. And the final portion goes into the Andean Youth Program, which is our second program, and that works with the most promising youth of this region to be able to offer post-secondary education scholarships so that they can get a career, get a degree in the career of their dreams and then return to their communities and give back through their resources and jobs. Our final program is up in North America, where we educate the youth who will be the future tourists and consumers about how to be a more positive impact than a negative impact. So just to conclude, I wanted to tell one last story about a lot of people ask me why. Why Peru, why textiles, why education? And I have a million academic reasons why. I think it is extremely valid, and I think it's very important for social justice and many other reasons. But the real reason comes back to a very personal promise that I made on July 22nd, 2006. And this was right after we had selected our first 20 scholarship students to enter the program. And the scholarship students asked me if we could have a welcome ceremony to tell the community what was going on, and they were just really proud of it. And so their mothers hiked down from their communities about 3 or 4 hours to hold a traditional feast. And it was a beautiful ceremony, but afterwards, it was also the day that I realized what I'd gotten myself into. Because on that day, one of the mothers, at the end, she was saying goodbye to me, and she held my hand and prayed in Quechua. And I don't speak Quechua, so I had no idea what she said. But then she spoke to me in Spanish, and she said, "You have to promise to get my son through school." And she wouldn't let go of my hand until I promised. And later that night, I was reading through the scholarship applications we had just given our students, and one of them had written, there was a section for other comments, and one of them had written, "I hope you don't just give us illusions and that you actually see this thing through." And it made me realize how many times people like me have come into this community, and communities like this all over the world, and seeing issues that are going on because of globalization and saying, "Oh, I can help you, I can change, I can do something." But then for some reason or another, they go back home and they forget all about their words. And whether or not they don't realize that their words had an impact, whether or not they just forget about their trip and think that it's a nice Facebook post and a nice photo album, or they go back home and realize how hard that promise actually is and they can't fulfill it. But whatever the reason, it's happened over and over and over again for decades, to the point where this community has very little trust, for good reason, and very little and disenchantment for a changed future, for any positive impact that's going to come from this development. And so that was my, after that I realized I have no idea what I'm doing, I have no idea how I'm going to do it, but I know why, and I know that I can't be yet another unfulfilled promise. And so I went back home, and long story short, it's 8.5 years later, and Moskoe has grown exponentially because of a variety of things. But we now support 15 different communities and 150 weavers, and we have over 75 students who've come through our university program. And 3 of our alumni are now on our board of directors to help be the leaders for their future generation with the work that they've done. So yeah, so that's a short version, but thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce Helena to please come up then as our keynote. But she's a person who's kept her promise for many decades to many people around the world, and we want to thank her very much for her stopover on her way to our conference to be able to discuss. Here's yours. You can just put that on. Actually, you can just take mine.
So, yeah. No mic. No, I don't need
It's
a
on
mic.
there, right there.
It's on there. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you, Joshua, for organizing this, and many thanks to Cowie for hosting us. I appreciate it very much. And I have been working on these issues now for 40 years. And as some of you may know, my work started in a place called Ladakh, or Little Tibet, which at that time was one of the very few regions in the world that hadn't been affected by colonialism or by modern development. So my thinking on all these issues has been shaped by this fairly unusual experience. And this part of Tibet belongs politically to India, and it's up at 12,000 feet. It's the westernmost part of the Tibetan plateau. And I arrived there as a linguist. I had learned to speak quite a lot of languages, but nothing like this language, which was a very difficult and complex language related to Chinese, but with a more complicated grammar. But I was fascinated by the people and the place, and ended up basically staying and working in this region now for 40 years, for part of every year. For many years, it was almost half of the year. And then our work, which expanded into a very big appropriate technology projects, and also working with crafts and so on. We were invited to work in other places like Bhutan, which you're probably more familiar with, another area of the world that had not been affected by colonialism or development. And later on, I wrote a book about my experiences in Ladakh and the changes that came with conventional development. And that was a book called Ancient Futures, and we also made a film. My husband John, who's there, has helped to make these films, joined me in these projects. And that film and book, Ancient Futures, were translated into 50 languages. We lost track of, there were some Inuit languages that we've lost track of, so it's about 50 languages. But from 50 different language groups, we kept getting the message that the story you're telling is our story too. So I feel a great obligation to these people and these voices to sort of keep telling this story. But it's very difficult, because part of what's happening is that the globalizing economy is having so much influence on our thinking and on our world that my message, which is essentially about the need to strengthen local economies, is something that is often a bit difficult to convey, and the importance of it is sometimes hard to understand. But that is essentially my conclusion after 40 years of working in many, many different cultures. So when I first arrived in Ladakh or Little Tibet, I found people who had the highest sense of self-esteem of any people I had ever encountered. And I had traveled quite a lot and been in San Cristobal de las Casas, you know, in Chiapas, where the Zapatistas are, and been very moved by the Indio tribes there. But I had never encountered people who just emanated such a joyful and vital sense of just a joy in life, and such a deep self-respect that the self wasn't an issue. You didn't have to sort of show off and prove that you were special. So I got to know, you know, these people very, very well. I learned to speak the language fluently in the first year, and everything that they would tell me was things like, you know, have you tasted all our delicious foods? And for me, there weren't that many. The variety wasn't that great, and I didn't even think they were that fabulous. But there was just this love of their own food, their own culture. And they would say, oh, you must stay in the winter. You know, that's when we have all these festivals. And it was true. In the winter, they basically had festival after festival, often at big monasteries with chanting and music, and there was very, very little work. There was some weaving and some carding of wool, and a lot of storytelling. They had a long, long history of oral traditions and a lot of music making. I mean, every child would be encouraged to sing and dance, already by the age of 1. And so I was just enchanted by these people and this way of life. And I found that their standard of living was also so much higher than anything I had imagined would be possible without modernity, without industrial production, without the type of global trade that we have today. They did actually trade, but essentially the sort of bulk of what they needed was very close to home. People produced, not so many vegetables. A lot of the vegetables were very small quantities and mainly wild vegetables from the mountains. But they produced grain, wheat and barley, and almost in every village you had different varieties, a huge biodiversity. And also they kept animals, so they had animal products, the yogurt and also a lot of butter, a lot of dried cheese that they would also keep over the winter. But there was no sign of hunger. And everywhere I went, people would say, "Tungbos zabos," which meant, we have enough to drink, we have enough to eat. And then on top of that, in this very cold climate, this is up at 12,000 feet, they lived in often 3-story houses that were just so beautiful. They were mainly stone and mud brick, very much like the Hopi Indian architecture, if you know that, flat-roofed and using their own wooden timber. They had poplars and willows and the poplar beams and with willow branches, and then essentially thick earth on top. And they had carved balconies and beautiful woodwork. It was not the comfort that we're used to. There was no heating, even though it dropped to -40 in the winter. And yet, people never complained about the cold. People would complain about the heat of the summer, which you and I would not find very difficult, because even though in the sun it got very hot, in the shade it was always cool, so it was never unbearably hot. But that's all I ever heard people complaining about. And over the years, I came to realize that probably the reason, of course, there was an adaptation, but there was also, I think, an annual adaptation, because as the weather changed, your body just gradually got used to weather getting colder and colder. And I came to that conclusion because for the first time when I traveled with Ladakis to England, and there were many things that happened on that trip, but one of them that happened was that they complained about the cold. And I realized it was from going into heated buildings and then coming out into damp cold. And that's the only way I could understand it, why in that, because those temperatures were nothing like as low as in Ladakh. So I basically found, in effect, quite a high standard of living. None of the sort of poverty that we see now, even in Ladakh now, or in the so-called Third World, or even in America. But what started happening was that as the development process started, people started changing, and particularly what was very clear was that the children were very, very influenced. Children are very vulnerable and malleable, and they were suddenly getting these images and ideas of a wealth and a power that was just beyond their imagination. It literally looked in the early days as though it would look here if you had Martians landing on these amazing planes that you'd never seen, and every day they would go out and spend $100,000. In the early days in Ladakh, as the changes started, this area was just thrown open to development, having been sealed off for political reasons. I forgot to mention that. And so as the area opened up, the parallel is people coming here, spending every day $100,000 and showing that, it's nothing to them. Now, young children got the impression, therefore, that we were just fantastically wealthy. $100,000 was basically in the Ladakhi economy $100. So when tourists came spending $100, they were spending roughly the sort of amount of money that a whole family might have spent in a year. And so this gave this dramatic impression of infinite wealth. And later on also images started coming through advertising. Ideas started coming through Western-style schooling. The Western-style schooling also actually explicitly said, we've got to get these backward farmers off the land into the city. It's the only hope for their future. So the engines of development go very deep and do have a very big root in this type of development is an idea of education that is fundamentally urbanizing. The idea, and this idea that schooling is going to get you a job in the city is now the reason why we have mass urbanization around the world. It's one of the major reasons. And it's not just because it functions as an idea, but structurally what's happening is that our funding, the way that we allow banks to create money and the way that money is used, the whole system is operating to fuel mass urbanization. I believe that one of the major issues we need to question and to look at is this link between a particular type of schooling and mega urbanization. Now, this is today in the climate, as I said earlier, we have so many ideas that are coming to us, many of them through a mindset that has been so, from my point of view, so lost in an urban, globalized economy, that the idea that, of course, we need education. I mean, I believe that the major and most important activity is education. And I want to see education as activism. I want to see people in the general public really seeing as an urgent issue that we really need to rethink some basic assumptions and get them out there quickly if we want to avoid the sort of calamitous future that we may be looking at if we don't do something that is systemic in nature. We need a systemic transformation that will really be looking at the levers of what is now a massive crisis of poverty and a massive crisis, of course, of global warming, but also of an extinction of species. You know, every day now, as we're speaking, we're losing species, and we're losing them along with the loss of languages and cultures. So the loss of species, massive CO2 emissions, and massive poverty. We all know now, the latest statistics say that 85 people own more wealth than half of the global population. Now we really have to be saying, wait a minute, there is something fundamentally wrong here. Many people believe that this massive poverty and massive pollution is a consequence of overpopulation. Now, if we think that the main cause is overpopulation, then we are facing a very, very difficult situation. We are facing a very difficult situation however we look at it, but from our analysis and from the growing network that I'm part of and have helped to build, we're right now building something we call an International Alliance for Localization. And from our international network, it's very, very clear that no, the major cause of this is not, thank goodness, overpopulation. Overpopulation is a major problem vis-a-vis resources. But overpopulation has nothing to do either with the poverty gap or with the mass pollution. I shouldn't say it's nothing to do with the pollution, but it certainly has nothing whatsoever to do with unemployment and poverty. The fact is that we are facing these crises for essentially ideas about how to grow the economy. And so how to grow the economy is an idea that has taken on a fundamentalist, almost religious trajectory. And unfortunately, most political leaders around the world today, including in my native country of Sweden, including Obama, it doesn't really matter if we're talking about left or right politics, most political leaders have now fallen into the trap of believing that the only way out is through more global trade, through more globalization. Now, what does that mean? It means that they are using our taxes to subsidize an infrastructure that furthers global trade. And that means that around the world, everything from the ports, which are being dredged to make more space for the even bigger container ships that now carry 80,000 containers on one ship, the trawling ships that use nets and that are like huge factories that will sweep everything out of the sea, killing all of the life in the sea, instead of fishing as we used to do, where human eyes would see, oh, that fish is not quite big enough, I'll put it back in again. You have this inhuman machine-like structure scooping up life and huge destruction. You have the airports growing and being expanded everywhere. You have the superhighways that have to be straighter and flatter for the ever bigger trucks that carry ever more stuff. And they're carrying it back and forth. We are not getting the information to really know what's going on. And it's not through a conscious conspiracy. What I would argue is that the system has become so big that unless we make an effort to understand that global economic system and how it operates, we're not going to see it. It's so big that I often talk about our arms having become so long that we can't see what our hands are doing. Because whether we're a consumer here in Honolulu, trying to buy something in the supermarket and trying to figure out, is that on the other side of the world leading to mass pollution or abuse of labor, it's virtually impossible to know as these distances become so big. So what we, and again I want to stress that this growth agenda, which is about supporting the global economy, is in effect supporting global banks and corporations. So when we use our taxes to increase the availability of easy, manageable infrastructure for Walmart, and around the world neglect the local infrastructure, neglect the smaller scale processing and management, the smaller scale localized infrastructures of everything from how do we fish to how do we grow our food to how do we build our houses. When we neglect the small and the local, what we're doing is essentially neglecting the needs of life itself. Because life itself is diversity. Every single human being is unique and different from every other human being. Every single plant, every single leaf that lives is unique and different. And it's not only different in a sort of permanent way, it's different from itself, from moment to moment. Life is this magical mystery unfolding. The cells in our bodies are changing as we speak. There's this constant life process going on. That infinite complexity and diversity requires the intelligence and the eyes, the human eyes, to acknowledge that life process, that diversity. What we're ending up doing is blindly supporting a globalized structure and globalized businesses that are not, the human beings inside them are not very different from you and me. But as a structure, we're supporting a way of doing things, a way of fishing, a way of farming, a way of building houses, and a way of thinking that is monocultural, that does not respect the diversity. It has been for far too long linked to technology and money. Technology and money are driving the way forward, not human intelligence, not social, psychological, spiritual values and knowledge, not the as I say, the complexity and the diversity of life. We've lost sight of that, and without realizing it, when we support I'm afraid almost all the schools, unfortunately, wherever you go, are essentially teaching the same curriculum. And let's remember, when we push people into an urban environment, we create a way of life that is virtually identical. If you go to Beijing, if you go to Mexico City, if you come to Honolulu, if you go to New York City, we have managed to create a standard world where the same cement and the same plastic and the same fossil fuels have shaped that reality. Now, we might think, many people think that, well, first of all, I guess there are about 3 major thought patterns that prevent us from looking at this bigger system. And one of them, as I say, is the assumption that most of the problems we're facing are due to overpopulation, or the other one is that we are greedy by nature. And I see a lot of people now saying, human beings, the human race, we are just greedy and aggressive by nature. We deserve to extinguish ourselves. And I know people my age who are saying, I give up. It's just too horrible what's happening. And I don't know how many of you hear these things. You may not be so involved in the environmental movement, but many of the people I have been dealing with are environmentalists, have been activists, but many of them are giving up. And there is also coming from science the idea that we only have another few years because of global warming. And I want to pause there just to say something about that, because my information, which also comes from dear friends who have been very high-level physicists, a close friend of mine was someone named Hans-Peter Dürr, who studied with Heisenberg, is a quantum physicist, was the head of the Max Planck Institute in Munich. And he always used to say to me, remember that we in science have learned a lot about what we have created. And science today is so enchanted with the sort of truths that they're generating from studying systems and, in effect, the impacts of their own doing and the technologies of their own doing and the incredible internet and so on. But, he said, I see very little progress in terms of understanding life, in terms of understanding the complexities of life. Now, for me, that is a great source of hope. In other words, I think the climate scientists who are telling us that some are saying we only have 15 years to live because of the methane releases in the Arctic now that are clearly very serious. But they are saying, give up hope, we're going extinct. I'm saying, for what it's worth, and to a great extent in conversation with people like Hans-Peter, that we do not know enough about the complexities of Mother Gaia to be able to say with certitude that our models and our predictions and our graphs are so reliable. I say that with a great deal of urgency about the need for us to reduce CO2 emissions. It's so clear that those CO2 emissions are toxic in every sense of the term, because they have actually led to a toxic social fabric as well. It's what has allowed us to build these towers of ignorance in our cement and plastic world. So we need to move off that as quickly as we can and move to a life-affirming way of living. However, we do not need to engage in a sense of total despair and resignation because some scientific modeling is saying, we only have 15 years. Some of them are saying that. So I think we urgently need to move away, but we also need to maintain our humility in the mysteries and the infinite complexity of life. So, however, now there is this urgency for so many reasons. We can see that the violence that's growing is, threatening life itself too, when we find that young people living in the Western world are becoming enraged and fundamentalist, and there's a threat of violence wherever we look. So we do have many reasons to feel concerned, even alarmed, but not despairing and not feeling that things are hopeless. What I have seen in terms of other cultures and what I have seen inside the Western world is that when people have a chance to recover their deeper humanity, and that has to do with reconnecting to life. It has to do with reconnecting to other people in a deep and meaningful and caring way. When children can grow up surrounded by people who see them, who hear them, who value them, when the life-based, face-to-face, local social fabric is alive, so that you are seen and heard, especially as a young person, then you can help create human beings who in turn become caring and are able to develop their hearts and their humanity. What really excites me is that I have also known of projects where prisoners or delinquent teenagers who their whole life had only known anger and violence and abuse, how they can turn around, sometimes in a matter of weeks and months, if helped, to feel that connection to other human beings. And the most effective projects include a reconnection to nature. So some of the projects I know are with teenage boys, as I say, who are angry and violent and who have gone a path that has been very destructive. Within 6 weeks of going out into nature, learning a few skills, actually seeing that they can actually be creative and productive, and connecting and sharing with other people. It can turn their lives away. Why do we not have more projects like that? Because in the current growth economy, it's too costly. We have a series of mechanisms within the global economy that are so linked to promoting large-scale technological, long-distance trade relationships that the human factor is being lost. We are literally taking a path of developing technology at every turn to replace human beings. Whether it's at the airport now where you've got all those machines instead of people checking you in, whether it's in long-distance learning, which yes, can be helpful, or whether it's in long-distance medical care, which yes, can be helpful when you don't have the local hospital or the local school or the local university that is really functioning as part of a rich fabric of local social, cultural, and economic relationships. When all of that doesn't exist, we can see these things as progress. But I am saying that we need to reassess what we mean by progress. We need a major U-turn towards nature and ecology instead of money and technology. And that means at a fundamental structural level, it's about rebuilding and reweaving the local fabric instead of fueling and supporting the global fabric. For me, what's so wonderful is to know that inside the global structures, the people are not very different from you and me. So we do not need to engage in demonizing people in power or particular corporations or demonizing anything or anybody. We need also to move away from feeling too much self-guilt. Because remember, in the Western world, the average consumer is on a daily basis being told, every day by the television news, have the consumers consumed enough? How is consumer spending? Have they spent enough? We have mechanisms in place that push us 24 hours a day to consume more. At the same time, when we hear about the environmental crisis, we're told that we're to blame. We're told that we shouldn't have been driving our car, we should have changed our light bulbs, we shouldn't have done this, we shouldn't have done that. So we're trapped in this completely contradictory and confusing mindscape that tells us on the one hand to be sure to consume more and more, and we're not just being told to do that, We're actually on a sort of roller coaster, or more than that, a fast train, where structurally we end up consuming more without even knowing it. When everything we need is produced in China, our CO2 emissions, our plastic packaging, our ecological footprint magnifies 1,000-fold. No one asked us. No one said, do you want to have all your jobs go to China? Do you want to have every shoe and every car and every potato and every head of garlic produced in China? Nobody ever asked us that. And the fact is, even most politicians were not asked. Because what happened is there was an idea about free trade, an idea about free trade treaties, which today has clearly led to a situation where corporations now sue governments if they do not adhere to the principle of allowing foreign exploitative investment to do as it pleases. How many of you know about these clauses, these ISDS clauses in the latest trade treaties? Do you know about them? None of you. This is really an urgent bit of information that is not some kind of conspiracy, or this is a fact that with NAFTA already, you had corporations suing Canada for in some way inhibiting the profit of a U.S. corporation. Now, the latest trade treaties, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, have made these clauses called ISDS clauses, as investor-state dispute settlement clauses, even more explicit, even more rigid. And you have things like a Swedish nuclear power company. We rejected nuclear power in Sweden, but through the relationship between government and big business, it's continued. And so a nuclear power company in Sweden called Waterfall is suing Germany for 3.7 billion euros because they decided to phase out nuclear after Fukushima. In the meanwhile, France is being sued by a company for raising their minimum wage. And these companies can sue even in terms of anticipated profit. This is not, we were going to be able to make like 3.7 billion out of Germany. Now you're phasing out nuclear. You can't do that. You give us 3.7 billion. I do feel encouraged because right now these latest trade treaties are leading to quite a lot of resistance. There was a consultation at the level of the EU, and 97% of people were opposed to this. I would love to meet the 3% who are in favor, but in fact, I have met some men in positions of power who are just so convinced that looking at their numbers on charts give them the best, the best way of dealing with what they see as reducing unemployment. They believe that continuing down this path is the way to create jobs. So they often feel that they have this mantle of responsibility, and the greenies who run around talking about, we must save this green frog and that bird over here, they're just not really responsible and caring enough about human life. That is their assumption, and they're so lost in their towers, usually up in high-rise towers in their cement world, that they believe what they say. So we, the people, are growing in number in terms of our awareness about this. There is a huge amount of pressure. I really hope you'll help to put the message out about this, because not only is awareness growing that this globalizing dynamic is not working, there is now this body of knowledge that has been saying for quite a while, and we were pioneers of this localization movement, particularly local food. We started writing about it, promoting it in more than a dozen countries, starting already in the 80s. And it's really taken off now. The local food movement is taking off. I am so happy to be working with something called a rural reconstruction movement in China, which is quite influential. It's, still, of course, a drop in the bucket in such a big country, but they are actually working with something like 6 universities and throughout China. Right now there are 200 new CSAs in China, community-supported agriculture. But we really need to understand that we have got to develop a type of think tank educational activity. The people who understand the importance of localization, like the permaculture movement, the bioregional movement, the eco-village movement, the transition town movement, Via Campesina. How many of you have heard of Via Campesina? Via Campesina has 200 million small farmers in their network from all around the world. So it's one of the biggest social movements in the world, and yet most people haven't heard of it. But let's turn that around, because these movements are growing, and they're growing in influence, but one of the key elements is that most of those movements, the local food movement, the slow food movement, so there are several others, most of them are people who are active and busy at the local level. And we have this gulf. How do we get out a systemic, a holistic analysis that provides a counter to the dominant, what people have called the neoconservative think tanks, that have funded ideas and that have put out the idea that we are selfish by nature, that this growth economy is a natural evolutionary trend, that globalization is about bringing us all together and collaborating, when it has actually been about giving Monsanto and McDonald's more freedom to move in and out of local economies and to sue governments. So we need to invest more in education as activism. We need, if you like, think tanks for localization. So I hope that you will look at our website. We have a website called Local Futures, and we have a film called The Economics of Happiness, where we outline this perspective I've tried to share today from a global point of view. And that film is now in about 20 languages, and it's being used around the world. I hope that you will help to get the word out and help to support efforts like ours to actually share this knowledge, to build up and to speed up the potential for these movements, not to just come out of grassroots blood, sweat, and tears, but to actually start getting policy support. We want to see these efforts translate into policies where governments pushed by us will be essentially pressured to get back around those same negotiating tables where they're negotiating with corporations, signing away our freedoms, this time negotiating with civic society at the table to start hearing the voice of the people. I have no doubt whatsoever that everywhere in the world, people would say they would prefer to have the subsidies and the infrastructures, the taxes, support fresh, healthy local food as a priority, as a human right, from Kenya to Honolulu, from Stockholm to San Francisco. People would prioritize that. But if they go into the shop and the stuff from China or Argentina costs less than from the farm down the road, what are they going to do when they're at the same time being pressured to pay higher and higher rents, higher and higher, more difficulty with the mortgage? So as people are financially squeezed in this crazy system, it becomes very difficult to make the right choices, the organic, ecological choices. So we need policy change. We also can start right now to more consciously link up with the localization initiatives that are happening in the area. We need much more support for the local food movement. There are many exciting projects that are about helping to train young people to engage in producing food for the regional or local market. We're not talking about eliminating trade, but we're talking about a situation where the need to counter and to supply local economies, particularly food, basic needs, but even finance. We work with Michael Schumann, we work with Ballet, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and other very interesting network, and they are demonstrating business options, they're demonstrating finance options. They're talking about shifting from Wall Street to Main Street. So as we shift our lives from Wall Street to Main Street, back home, as we bring the economy back home, not only do we benefit materially, financially, democratically, we have more say over our lives, but most importantly of all, we benefit in terms